You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Scientists and politicians may not agree on whether climate change is natural or caused by human activities. But one thing is certain, even a small wobble in temperature or precipitation trends can cause trouble for farmers. A U of M geography professor tells us more about our recent weather extremes. Katherine Klink is an associate professor of geography at the University of Minnesota. Katherine, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
Thanks.
This past summer, the summer of 2010, we had more tornadoes than any other state in the country. This past winter, we saw some of the heaviest snowfall in the state's history, and this summer, 2011, we experienced the highest dew point in state history. What is going on with our weather, and how unusual has this all actually been?
Well, the good question is, what is going on with our weather? One way to think about it is that our weather is always variable, and extremes happen. And so I don't know that we have any specific answer to why these particular years have had these specific events occur. It is fairly unusual in the sense that we have broken records. So that by definition means it's been unusual. But extremes are not unexpected in Minnesota, as many of us who've lived here a long time will attest. One of the things that's interesting from a climatological point of view is that if you look at the history of records, climate records of highest dew points and heavy snowstorm events and things like that, you see that for the most part, many of the records that we've broken recently, the most recent last record was also in the last, say, 50 years or so. So many of the records that we've set have been in the last 50 years, so 1950s, a lot of them in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so climatologically, it sort of suggests that there is something changing in the environment, changing in the climate. We're still setting records like we have in the past, but the level of that record's been inching up.
And in Minnesota, aren't we fortunate to have a broader base of records than a lot of other locations? Because didn't observations begin at Fort Snelling back in the early part of the 1800s?
In Minnesota, we are very fortunate. So researchers at the Minnesota Office of the State Climatologist have done, and colleagues at the university here have done a great job going back and looking at records from Fort Snelling and from all kinds of places around the state. We don't have records for all things. Those records are largely temperature and precipitation. So things like the dew point record have a much shorter basis of comparison, but since we've had instrumental records, certainly we can do those comparisons. And again, the recent dew points, by definition, it's a record, but if you look at the history, the dew points have sort of also been creeping up, even though we don't have 100 years of record to base that on.
Are we going to have to get used to these weather extremes? Is this the new normal for us?
There is some indication that that could be the case. One of the things that climate change science tells us is that as the climate warms, it's more likely to get extreme events. Because we know extreme events happen. They happen all the time. We've had them in the past. We'll continue to have them in the future. And one of the questions then is there a new extreme? So does a dew point of 75, which used to be, something that we would remark on, oh my gosh, the dew point is 75, maybe we won't start remarking on it until it hits 78 or 80 or something like that. And so again, these kinds of changes are consistent with the kinds of things we would expect based on our understanding of the science of climate change.
Are you and perhaps other climatologists concerned about the extreme weather, these climate changes, and how it might impact the growth of crops?
The concern with climate change is that now we have to worry about the impacts of climate change on top of the normal things that, say, farmers or agriculturalists would worry about. And so things such as we might have, there could be a higher frequency of hailstorms, which would damage crops, of course. Or we might have a higher frequency of both drought and flood, which seems sort of odd. But when we think about climate change, there's a change in the extremes. And so having more days with heavy precipitation and then more days in between precipitation at all. So you can have a drought and then suddenly get a whole bunch of rain. And so these are the kinds of things that farmers have tried to manage for in the past. But now thinking about climate change, is this the kind of thing that farmers are going to have to think about different kinds of strategies or additional strategies to try to cope with the increased amount of uncertainty and the increased frequency of extreme events that they might have to cope with?
Are there any crops in Minnesota that are more vulnerable than others to climate change?
Well, one thing that Minnesota does have is a number of cool season crops, such as barley, oats, and wheat. And so these are crops that are adapted to cool summers, essentially. And so this is why they're grown in Minnesota, right? Especially up towards the Red River Valley, there's a lot of small grains, barley, for example, in particular. So one of the concerns that some agronomists have, and so I've done some work with Joachim Wiersma, who is an agronomist at the University of Minnesota in Crookston. And he's a barley breeder. And so one of the concerns that the folks in the barley world have is that because barley is sensitive to high temperatures, will it become too warm in Minnesota to successfully grow barley? It may be the case that these cool season crops, which are, again, they don't do well when it gets too hot. And so if it gets too hot, they just, we don't have good beer the next year or something like that. So that is one concern. And so some of the things that one could do to adapt to that, I imagine, would be to breed barley that would be temperature, more resistant to high temperatures, but also to switch from a spring barley to a winter barley. You plant it in the fall. Now our winters might be warm enough that the barley survives, and then it just grows in the spring and you harvest it before it gets too hot. So there are some strategies that people have been thinking about.
Climate change remains a controversial subject and still has many skeptics, despite an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community.
Yeah.
How do you deal with the skeptics in your research? How do you think the issue is going to be seen as still up for debate in spite of all the scientific evidence?
Well, one of the things that I think is going on is the science is very clear, and if you ask almost every scientist, there are still some scientists who are skeptical. And quite honestly, that's our job. It's our job as scientists to be skeptical about things. But I think the scientific story is pretty well settled, is that the physics behind radiation transfer and all of those things that contribute to the greenhouse effect is very well understood. And there are lots of feedbacks going on with the climate between clouds and all of these kinds of things that make it a little bit difficult to trace, particular cause and effect. But I think that the scientific community, I would say there's definitely a consensus in the scientific community. And I believe that much of the arguments come not really because of the science, but because of what the science would mean. We have to make some choices, we have to make some decisions in the face of uncertainty, which again, as a society, we do all the time. It is the kind of thing that connects with a lot of our lives in terms of the way that we've built cities, for example. So we have infrastructure in cities that is built to handle a certain amount of rainfall. And if we get more than that, then culverts can't handle the water, we get backups in the sewer system. So there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of things going on that we've kind of built around our current climate. And so it's a really big question. If the climate's going to change, it touches on a lot of different parts of our lives. And it's very difficult to get your head around how do we even tackle this giant event. But another thing that I think that we can think about is that we can I think move past the fact that the science is there. We understand that climate can change. We know there's there's a human caused signal there. We can trace that in the kind of carbon that's in the atmosphere. We know it's come from fossil fuels. And so then the question then becomes sort of a political question and a moral question and an economic question and an ethical question of how do we deal with knowing this information? Because it has ramifications. Are we going to continue to use fossil fuels? That has a big impact on the way we live our lives, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. How are we going to grow our corn? How are we going to, what are we going to base our economy on? And how does that impact people who work in the fossil fuel industry? Because, they have lives and we don't want to just, you can't just cut people off at the knees and say, sorry, we're not doing that anymore.
Are we adopting the kinds of policies and practices that we need to in order to help deal with the effects of climate change and to hopefully lessen the impact? Are we moving fast enough in that direction?
I'm not sure if we're moving fast enough, but we are moving. There are certainly things going on within Minnesota and the nation and around the world of people trying to think about what are some ways that we can build in resiliency, whether it comes, whether we have to be resilient to the effects of climate change or the effects of anything else that might happen, an earthquake, a volcano, I'm not sure what else. But things, there's always something unexpected, right? We've all had unexpected things happen in our lives. And so there's a lot of emphasis now on thinking about having societies that are resilient. So if there's a change in the climate, if it gets warmer, we have a way to cope. If it gets cooler, we have a way to cope, or we have some processes in place. And so there are cities such as I've recently learned about the city of St. Paul is going to have a climate change scenario planning workshop. So to think about, well, what could happen and how could we prepare ourselves for different kinds of possible impacts. So how can we think about this sort of thing? And it's not banking on, yes, it's going to get warmer and yes, we're going to have more floods, but just what happens if we have a lot of different things that are going on? How can we build a society, build a city that can respond appropriately?
Katherine Klink, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Minnesota. Thanks for joining us again on Access Minnesota.
All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. Be sure to visit us at accessminnesotaonline.com. You can also find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We'll see you next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.